So,
So
all right,
there's
welcome
Mary.
everybody to Zoom Palace. I'm going to
Oh,
dispense with the music since we're on my PowerPoint is long. I mean, this is going to go over an hour. I'm sure.
okay.
There's so much to talk about. But what I'm going to do is just start out with a PowerPoint, and then I'll stop, and
Okay.
we'll Frank, you can and put what yours. But what I'm going to do is in the very beginning, and the theme today is Israel and organized crime. So the question is, what is the Israeli mafia? The Israeli mafia are crime groups that are operating in Israel. The Israeli mafia, the organized crime groups operating in Israel, consisting of Israeli members. There are 16 crime families operating in Israel. 5 major groups active on the national level and 11 smaller organizations. There are 6 Maghrebi Jewish crime families and 3 main Arab crime families. Many heads and members of the crime groups have either been killed or are in prison. And the major crime groups are the Abergils, the Abutbuls, the Alperons, the Dumranis, the Shirazis, the Amir Molnar, and the Zaid Rosenstein syndicates. The illegal activities they're engaged in include operating casinos and other forms of gambling inside and outside of Israel, car theft, prostitution, human trafficking, money laundering, murder, protection, extortion rackets, loan sharking, and drug dealings. And the reason we're doing this, is because the propaganda in the United States that Israel is the only democracy in the Middle East, it's this wonderful utopian state, a model for every other state to emulate. And this is just not true when you look at actually what goes on there. Now, and this will be the last slide I'll show, maybe one more, according to Israel's former police commissioner, Israeli crime organizations have penetrated the formal economic sector and local governments and have equipped themselves with large quantities of combat means, explosives, and arms. Lots of car bombings, lots of assassinations. In a mob war starting in the early 2000s between crime families, several crime bosses were killed. It also cost the lives of innocent bystanders. The Lakba is the Israeli special police unit that fights organized crime. And there's an interview. So I'll stop here. This is a great interview by an Israeli, very popular Israeli broadcaster who has 33 minutes on Israeli organized crime, and he's an Israeli, So let's stop here. And Frank, do you want to share what you have to say?
Thank you, everybody. I'm actually in an airport and I got 30 minutes. So I just want to ask you a question. What is the connection, if there is, between the Israeli government and organized crime? If so, because all of you are aware of what's happening to the Palestinians and that Israel is now up Israeli leaders before the ICC for war crimes. If we are supporting the United States in particular as an accomplice to Israeli potential war crimes, what does that mean? Are we an accomplice also to its connection with organized crime? So what is the connection? Let's just get to it. We're not here to trash Israel. Almost all of us believe the concept of Israel is a good one, but we're here to reveal that our support, undivided support of Israel, perhaps is misdirected and we need to make a change. Israel needs to change politically. What's the connection? Well, one of the most serious connections is when Inbal Gavriela, the niece of one of Israel's most powerful mob bosses, was elected to the Knesset. And while she was a member of parliament, she tried to use her immunity to prevent her father's house from being searched by the Israeli police, investigating illegal gambling, tax evasion, and other things that you cited, Jackie. Another one, this is just a tip of the iceberg. David Bitan, an Israeli lawyer, was taking loans from members of the Jerusi crime gang, which is an Arab crime gang in Italy. and wasn't able to repay them, was borrowing a lot of money. Again, Mr. Bitan is a member of the Knesset, along with Inbel Gavrieli. And since he couldn't repay these large sums of money, he was giving favors and forgiveness of loans and other favors to the Jerusi family crime gang, which is one of the most powerful crime families in Israel. That's a direct connection. So what is the connection? The Likud party, as we know, coming from, that militant group that we talked about last week, Irgun, that was responsible for the Dan Nasser, and the several massacres, evolved into the Likud party. And these, Imbal Gavrieli, elected to the Knesset, whose father was a powerhouse in an important organized crime group, is also Likud party. But we also have people like Ben Gvir, as we've talked about, very militant, very right-oriented, very racist Jew who wants Israel for Jews. I will not say that he's in favor of organized crime, but we've got these connections with the Likud party, direct Likud party. And so what is another connection with the government that we have to look into? We've talked about money laundering and so forth, but let's see directly what's happening here. Interest groups have a tremendous sway in the Knesset as well as the U.S. Congress, right? Largely run the representing investment scam lobbies, very powerful groups that are scamming people of billions of dollars every month, largely run by the mafia. These interest groups are extremely well represented as lobbyists before the Knesset. So, and what is an indication that they have power? These fraudulent online trading companies connected, these investment companies, which are in control, a lot of them are controlled by the Israeli organized crime. They had a bill to make these trading companies, fraudulent trading companies, in other words, they're doing illegal gambling, numbers, all types of different illegal things, was before the Knesset. There was a bill before the Knesset to make them illegal. And the anti-fraud advocates were stunned when they arrived in the Reform Committee in the Knesset to find out that the bill had been very much watered down because they got the Knesset, this committee got input from these large, powerful lobbyist groups who disagreed with this bill, and it was watered down. This is just the tip of the iceberg, just specific examples. And and you'll go into this, I'm sure, Jackie, but the money laundering scams have been very important because the Russian mafia, for instance, that you'll probably talk about, and others, saw Israel as an ideal place to launder money.
Absolutely.
And it was because there was very little legislation, and these, in particular, Jews, were going to Israel for Aliyah and bringing all their money and investments with them, and they were welcomed with open arms by the Israeli government. But a lot of this was dirty money. And how do you launder money? Well, you can open up bank accounts, right? You can purchase. This is what they were doing. They're purchasing real estate. That's a perfect way to launder money, is simply purchase real estate with dirty money. Then you become legit. You've got legitimate property there. And there have been a very little legislation controlling this. Just recently, there is legislation now making this money laundering schemes illegal. But my question is, how much is it enforced against some of these big groups that also have very powerful lobbyists before Knesset? So, the investment scams with the government seems to ignore, because it's getting a lot of money. There have been many powerful Israeli Jews, returning to Israel through Aliyah and bringing their dirty money and their scandals and so forth. The question is, how close is the mafia, organized crime to Israel. This makes it very risky for Israel to proceed with this because you've got, and I'll conclude here because I know you have a lot more, just to give my input on certain things. I'm not going to go into Palestinian organ stealing, not just from Palestinians. Are you going to go into that?
Yes,
Where
yeah.
actually,
Yeah.
organ stealing and the
Yeah.
organ trafficking, vital organ trafficking is huge. And it's been supported by the Israeli Health Association and in Department of Defense as well. I will leave that to you to go into. The bottom line then, I will go to my conclusion is this then. If we give unbridled support to a country, and we see it's going to be difficult. I'm one of the lawyers representing the Palestinians before the International Criminal Court against specific people like Netanyahu, Lieberman, Gantz, Trump, and Obama for war crimes. And we can see the United States as a direct and accomplice, not just feeding money to Israel. We can help our ally out. But in the middle, just one quick example, in the middle of the 2014 Gaza-Israeli crisis, the Israeli Air Force was targeting, was proven, human civilians. And, they killed a lot of women and children and so forth. Obama went on TV and would complain about it, but 3 days later sent $700 million worth of arms and assistance to Israel. This, under international criminal standards, is an accomplice to a war crime. So if we're supporting, my conclusion is we're supporting a potential war criminal. And if the ICC finally makes a decision, and it is an uphill struggle to get them to finish their investigation, because we won the first round, we won the round on jurisdiction. Praise the Lord. Now we go to the merits of the case. We need to send in arrest warrants to appear. If those are not complied with, then we can't have trial in the ICC in Holland, but we need a trial. And that's the next procedure. But what about the organized crime element? If we are with giving unbridled support to a government that is a war criminal, that's committed atrocities, to what extent is the mafia taking over Israel? And there are countries that we can see that have become very corrupt, like Russia and others. And would we also be considered an accomplice to organized crime in Israel? That's my conclusion.
Thank you, Frank. I think that.
Thanks for letting me go on first. I appreciate it.
There's
a lot more to it.
Feel free to interject. Thank you very much for your presentation. So we'll go back to my PowerPoint because it covers a lot of what we've been talking about. Here we go. Let me see. Oh, no, this is it. Here we go. See if I can share this. Okay, so let's, we're going to, maybe I'll start from the beginning just quickly because it went off of the, all right, play from start, which is for some people who came in a little late. Israel organized crime. We talked about what the mafia is. It's a group of 16 crime families, mostly Jewish families and 3 Arab families. And I list all the major groups and what they do: gambling inside and outside of Israel, car theft, prostitution, human trafficking, money laundering, murder, protection, extortion rackets, loan sharking, drug dealing, and human organ trafficking. They're very influential, and I'm also going to talk about the daughter of the mob figure who got elected to Knesset. They're very violent, lots of explosions, assassinations, car bombs that occur. And now we're going to look at this really fascinating video by a very popular Israeli broadcaster, because many Israelis are not aware of the corruption of the mob in their lives. Some are, some are not. So this is I
was actually oddly involved in a tertiary way. So in 2009, I was living in Jersey City and I was working at the
Let me get to the beginning. I'm sorry. Uh,
Shalom, shalom, shalom. Hey, what's going on? What's going on? What's going on? My name is Michael Sano. Welcome, welcome, welcome to the 12 Cities in Israel podcast, the only positive podcast about the state of Israel. Hey, listen. If this is your first time watching, don't forget to hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, and the notification bell so you're always in the loop when a brand new episode comes out. If you want to take this with you on the road, on the street, you can find us at SoundCloud, iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, TuneIn, and on Spotify. Okay, this episode, this is going to be a crazy one. This one is on organized crime in Israel. Wow. So a lot of my episodes over the past couple of weeks have been on some of the and I'm remiss to say this, some of the negative things that exist in Israel. But Israel is
different stories. How
this
can I
concept.
help you?
There are individuals who have this concept of
I think
Israel
you
as
guys be
this
at the office today. Are you there? Because I was there yesterday and no one was there.
and
Well, I'm, going to be here until 3 o'clock.
to us.
How can I help you?
3 o'clock.
We close at 3 on Saturday.
Okay, that's fine. I was there yesterday around noon or 1 or something, and nobody was there, and my key wasn't working. And I know you have one in my file, so
Mhm.
I just wanted someone to be in the office to help me with that.
Okay, can I ask you a favor? Can you give me your name and your number of your unit?
Yes, it's Abby Rosen. You looked it up for me last time.
Hi, my
Okay,
name is Michael Sutton.
and
Okay,
And I
I-
love Israel.
yeah,
and your
Wow.
key didn't work. Did I
It would nope.
did
hold-
I have an extra key?
Yeah.
Yes, you did.
Did you try the extra one?
Let me see if I can get Sarah and
You weren't there to give it to me.
Okay, what is your unit number?
let me mute her.
It's
Okay, there we go. All right, sorry about that. All right, man. All right, here we go again. Hope everybody can see this screen. Hi, welcome Terry. Welcome on Facebook, Nawal and Mustafa. All right, so I'm sorry for the
I was actually
and we'll
to the 12. Tune in and on Spotify. Okay, this episode, this is going to be a crazy one. This one is on organized crime in Israel. Wow. So a lot of my episodes over the past couple of weeks have been on some of the and I'm remiss to say this, some of the negative things that exist in Israel. But Israel we have this concept. There are individuals who have this concept of Israel as this utopian Jewish state. And that's what's been, conveyed to us as to what Theodore Herzl had wanted in his book, The Jewish State. But it is a modern Western democracy, and in modern Western democracies, you get a little bit of the good and a little bit of the bad. You hopefully get a lot of good and very little bad, but hey, people are people, and they're going to try to do things. Now, organized crime is a significant problem in Israel. I'm going to read to you just some quick information. Organized crime groups operating in Israel are comprised of about 16 crime families. Whoa, that's huge. There are, I think, the 5 families in New York and basically New Jersey. They have 16 of them in this small country. 5 major groups are active on the national level and 11 smaller organizations. And I'm going to go into how that works. There are 6 Maghrebi Jewish crime families active, and those are Moroccan Jews, and 3 Arab crime families. I was only able to find out about 2 of them. I'm going to look through this and see if maybe I can find that other one. But what it says is many heads and members of the crime groups have either been killed or are in prison. Now, like any criminal organization, you have different kinds of organizations, and in the organized crime organizations, that sounds ridiculous. The organized crime organizations. In those types of situations, they set up a structure so that if the boss goes, somebody slides into place. Usually without a lot of violence. Violence is part and parcel of what they do, but in terms of structure, and what happens when there's a power vacuum, a lot of times, since these are families, somebody in the family just steps up, somebody who is expected to be the prince, and in some cases the princesses of these crime families. So yeah, there's a lot to go into. Now, this says the major crime groups are the Abergils, the Abutbus, the Alparons, and the Dumranis, the Shirazis, the Molnar, and the Rosenstein syndicates. Now, I don't know when this, and I'm getting some of this from Wikipedia and some of it from other sources, some good, really good articles on it. Now, some of this information in the Wikipedia is pretty dated. And what I did is I went and I found, I think it's Tablet magazine. They went through, and this article is from, let me double check. It is from 2019, and it is entitled A Field Guide to Israeli Organized Crime. So I'm going to quickly read off the names of these organizations. And these appear to be the prominent organizations in Israel as of last year. We're going to start with the Abergil, which I mentioned, and it's run by Yitzhak Abergil, which is in Lod. And that's his area. That's where he grew up. He grew up in a really just crappy upbringing, into violence. At 5 years old, it says that he brought a gun to school and started shooting it. Just not at people. He aimed it at some kids, but he just started shooting it, and he went to jail at a very young age. And when you think of Lod, you think of Ben Gurion Airport. So you don't really think of a town being a town. But the Abergil organization, that's the number one. The Mulner organization, run by Amir Mulner out of Ramat Gan, he's a pretty heavy hitter. The Domrani, which I mentioned, run by Shalom Domrani down in Ashkelon. I have a video where they talk about the opening of illegal clubs and stuff like that. And I'm going to include that in the description. And they got a new police chief who's cracking down on this stuff. But I don't know. This article, the video was from 2015, I think, and this article is from 2019. So they're still going strong. He runs Ashkelon, and it said basically the Negev region. And there's another guy, and I almost said gentleman. These people are not gentlemen. Zaguri, Nivi Zaguri, out of Beersheba, and he works with Domrani. It says, it alleges that he works with Domrani. You have the Moore organization run by Michael Moore, not that Michael Moore, out of Naharia. I always say that wrong, and I can't get it right, so just bear with me. The Mosley organization, run by Yossi Mosley in South Tel Aviv. They're a pretty violent organization, and I think that's the one that came up. He was under, not Abergil, Baron, he tutored in organized crime. Is that a thing? Under Baron, I could be wrong. You have the Shirazi organization, which is run by Rico Shirazi in Netanya, and he was a guy. His brother is a retired professional footballer, and he was going to be one as well. And then he broke his knee, or he had a bad knee injury, and then went into organized crime, because that's what you do. You fail at your thing, and your backup is organized crime. Yeah, I don't buy that. This guy was probably dirty a lot longer than just, he fell into it. So, and then you have the Haya organization run by Aitan Haya in Tel Aviv. And this guy, I guess, is another. He was under Rosenstein, which I spoke of in the beginning. Rosenstein Syndicate was a big deal. Now, let's talk about Israel-Arab coexistence. You have two other Israeli-Arab groups. These aren't even in the territories. These are two Israeli-Arab groups. The UDA organization under Keter Koko UDA, run by the Jerushi organization run by Milad Jerushi. So it's funny because these Arab organizations aren't just, these are some of the satellite organizations that they're talking about, just like the in Beersheba organization is sort of like a satellite organization that runs underneath Domrani, but is independent of it. They make their own decisions. But I guess what these groups do is they go and they want to do something like, I'm going to take an example, and I can't remember which one it was exactly, but one of the mob bosses in prison, it was either one of the mob bosses in prison didn't like the conditions, or the mob organization itself didn't like the way its organization members were being treated in prison. So they went and had the prison shot up from the outside. Nobody was hurt, thank God. But they think that one of these Israeli Arab organizations contracted to go and do that. So these guys work hand in hand. It's pretty fascinating. Now, if you look into the history of organized crime, let's go a little pre-state, and let's look at a history of organized crime in the United States. And the reason we should do something like that is because a lot of the immigrant groups that moved to Israel also moved to the United States either at the same time or decades before. Okay, let's look at the turn of the century with Meyer Lansky and all those guys from the New York mob. And these guys took advantage of the fact that you had an underrepresented group, I guess. You had an underrepresented group in the boroughs of New York City. And they extorted them, and they took their money with gambling, and they did all kinds of stuff. Drugs weren't really their forte at the time, but basically, all of the lessons that were needed in order to establish organized crime in Israel were established in the United States 70 years earlier. You know what I mean? 100 years earlier. So these guys have been doing this stuff for a long time. They're even involved. So, all right. So let's look at what they're involved in. Let me take a sip of coffee. Peter Madeira, this is for you. What's up? So again, I love Israel. Israel is dear and near to my heart, but there are things about Israel that I wish didn't exist. But I think in order to be an objective portrayer of what Israel is. I have to talk about all the different things, both positive and negative, that occur in Israel. Yes, I am selective in some of the stuff that I discuss, and yes, I do put a lot of my opinion into it. But I'm human. I try to be as objective as possible. The reason I'm saying all that is about all of the things that I am about to discuss, all the things that they are involved in. It might be a little bit shocking to some of the people watching this. To some of you, it might not be, but the Israeli mafia, organized crime groups in Israel are involved in murder for hire. They're involved in drug smuggling and distribution of cocaine, of ecstasy, of what else? Methamphetamines, all kinds of stuff, heroin, everything. They're in it all. And it's international trade. They're not just involved in it in Israel. They're involved in it in Europe. They're involved in funneling it to the United States. A lot of it. They're also involved in the trafficking, sex trafficking. So one of the things that I found out in all of the research that I was doing is that prostitutes in Israel, if you didn't know, there are prostitutes in Israel. There is prostitution in Israel. Oldest job, oldest profession in the history of the world, prostitution. It exists in Israel. I am not opining on it. I am just telling you that it happens. What I found out is that the vast majority, we're talking like 99.99% of the prostitutes in Israel come from former Soviet Union countries, Eastern Bloc countries. And they're brought by another element that's not discussed in this article, and I don't know why it's not discussed in this article. I did find a little bit about it, but I think there might be a level of fear as to why it's not discussed. So during the large aliyah from the former Soviet Union in the 80s, certain elements of Russian organized crime, who may or may not have been Jewish, I don't know. I'm not going to opine on that because I don't have enough information to tell you that they were faking it. But there are some who have alluded to the fact that maybe these people weren't Jewish, not all of them, that the organized crime people saw a business opportunity. Needless to say, a large number of Bratva, who are Russian organized crime members, immigrated to Israel, used the lax banking system that allows for funds to be brought into the country in order to launder billions of dollars. And then they also set up their drug connections that they had already established in Europe through Israel. And on top of that, they brought sex trafficking from these Eastern European countries. So the majority, from what I understand, and if I'm wrong, let me know. If you know more information, I want to get someone on this show to interview about this because this is fascinating, because it is just a deeply woven web. The Russian mafia brought over all of these women to be trafficked as prostitutes in Israel. So yes, they're into that. They're also into organized crime in Israel is also involved in extortion. What is extortion? It's when I tell you, if you don't want your windows to be broken, you gotta pay me X number of dollars every week, month, whatever. So they're involved in that. And we're going to get into extortion later because there's another group that is linked to organized crime. I haven't been able to get a lot of information on it. I want to get more because it's an interesting story. So there's extortion, and then there's also gambling. So one of the groups, and it was the one in Tel Aviv. Was it the one in South Tel Aviv? I think it was. And it was Yossi Mosley, the Mosley organization, I guess. So what happened was a bunch of these big mob guys got rounded up in the early 2000s, between 2003 and 2010. In 2003, the Israeli government decided that it had had enough because of a WikiLeaks cable that was released that outlined who the member families were and all of that to the US State Department. Excuse me, I'm sorry about that. So due to probably embarrassment at the fact that they weren't doing anything, the Israeli government decided to get involved, and a bunch of these people, the Abergils, the Barons, the Abutbuts, all of their heads went to jail. Some of them were indicted and went to the United States and agreed to serve their jail times in Israeli jails. Kind of a sweet deal, I guess. But this guy, Yossi Mosley, was under one of those guys, and when the arrest happened, he kind of branched out pretty violently and started his own casinos, underground casinos in South Tel Aviv. Now, about the violence. So one of the things that's going on and has gone on over the past 15 years is there are a lot of what on the outside look like terrorist activities, car bombings, random shootings in the streets. But these are all done as retaliatory measures between mob families or against informants. So being an informant in Israel is basically a death sentence. I know it normally is with anything. I mean, with any organized crime, you've got a target on your back. But these guys, they really go after them. They blow up prosecutors' vehicles. They blow up defendants' vehicles, the defense attorney vehicles. And it wasn't clear, is it their own defense attorney? They didn't like it, so they blew up the guy. He wasn't hurt, but these guys, when they feel wronged, they rampage. And it is violent and it is excessive. But I spoke to a friend of mine. I was on the phone with a friend of mine, and she gave me a lot of insight as to whether or not this is something that is felt every day. So the reason that's important is because one of the things when I went to Israel, everyone said, "Are you worried? Are you nervous? Do you feel like it's going to be safe?" And I was like, "Absolutely. Why? What are you talking about?" "Well, on the news, well, the same thing goes for this. If you watch the news and looked up stuff on the Israeli mob, you would think that they were blowing up bombs everywhere and you couldn't leave the house. It's the same with terrorism in Israel. There is terrorism in Israel, but it doesn't happen so often that you feel it. So she was basically telling me, yes, these things are public things and we're aware of them, but overall, you don't get a sense of organized crime in Israel, which is good. That's actually pretty great. That's awesome. Now, I have covered all of the families. I've covered all the stuff that they're involved in. I've covered how violent they can be. I've covered and they are so violent. And a lot of times they do this stuff when they do an attack. Like 2 of these attacks that I read about were done right in front of the individual's children. So these people are savages. These people who involve themselves in this criminal behavior are absolute savages. There's no questions about it. That's it. That's pretty much it. What I wanted to talk about next was another group that is, how do I say this? And I want to be really careful. So one of the things that I don't want to do is one of the things that's been done historically in Israel since the creation of the state. So and this is it's gonna sound like it's not really connected, but it is connected. So when the when the expulsion happened and in the 50s, and the Persian Jews were expelled from Iran, and the Iraqi Jews were expelled, and the Moroccan Jews were expelled, and all the Mizrahi and Sephardi came to Israel and were put into camps, basically, internment camps, because they didn't know where to put them. So many of them came, they were looked down upon. And they were looked down upon because of their customs, their close familial ties, and their religiosity. Something that the secular Jewish state didn't really have too much use for at the time. So they were always purported to have bad behavior. The Mizrahis and the Sephard, Mizrahim and the Sephardim. And it didn't apply to all of them. There were bad groups, but it wasn't all of them. But one of the things that happens over time is you start saying that lie, and pretty soon, Sephardis, they're all involved in organized crime, or they're all involved in bad things. It's not true. And I want to be very clear about my criticisms of the things that I've heard about the next group I'm going to discuss, which is ultra-Orthodox organized crime, or allegations of organized crime within the ultra-Orthodox community. And that's actually very specific, and it's good that it's specific, because there have been allegations of extortion, criminal extortion, within the Haredi community, both Haredi, Hasidim, all of them. But I was talking to my friend because I wanted to get kind of the straight dope, and there's somebody else that I need to talk to about this to get a little bit of a clearer picture. But it appears it is a thing. Now, I remember reading a story about corruption within the kashrut organizations, which are the groups, the panels that give your kosher certification to businesses and to, butchers and all that stuff. One of the things that came up in the article is that people were taking bribes for this stuff. So if they're taking bribes, it was also alluded that they might be upcharging people, saying, if you want to keep your kosher certification, you need to pay us. Well, that's extortion. What I was talking to my friend about what she was telling me when I told her about this is that, yeah, it also extends to other religious things, such as what? Such as divorces, such as weddings, not just kashrut, but all different levels of religious service that they do, and that they do. If a family is shunned, let's say a family shunned, they have to pay back in, which is kind of extortion, but not overt. And I every time I read about it, it was almost as if it was passed over as a story, or it was a blurb and then they moved on, because there is a fear that if we start criticizing the ultra-Orthodox community, that it could be heard as anti-Semitic. And that's not my intention at all. Being a Jew, I'm finding that pretty difficult to stomach, but whatever. But if there are problems and there are members of the ultra-Orthodox community that are engaging in criminal extortion, it needs to be exposed and they need to go to jail. Now, in the research that I did for this, and there was a ton done, I did come across this story that I was actually oddly involved in a tertiary way. So in 2009, I was living in Jersey City, and I was working at the pool, the municipal pool. I was a stay-at-home dad, and it was a great part-time job, and I worked for the city of Jersey City. Well, there was a big sweep, and they arrested like 50 people, like a ton of people, and 5 of those people were Orthodox rabbis, ultra-Orthodox rabbis, Syrian Jews. And basically what was happening was they had yeshivas, charitable organizations, and all this stuff, and they were receiving money from not very clean sources, criminal activity, basically. And they would say, okay, donate to the yeshiva, donate to the charity, and we then ask for your refund back and we'll return it to you. I.e., it was clean, it was laundered. That is money laundering. That is criminal organization behavior. So, yes, and there are ties between this guy and Israel, but they never really went into it, and I don't know what the depths of it are. But you have to assume if it's happening one place, it's probably happening other places. And there may even be connections between these mob families that I spoke about and these charitable organizations. I'm not saying that they are, but it's not a leap to envision that that is something that is going on. So, all right, that's all my information on organized crime in Israel for this episode. I'm going to finish up by telling you guys that Hi, my name is Michael Sana. I'm Jewish and I love Israel. So if you love Israel, if you love being Jewish, or if you have an unwavering connection to the land of Israel, then you're in the right place. Welcome to the 12 Cities in Israel podcast. Shalom, shalom, shalom. Hey, what's going on? What's going on? What's going on? My name is
No
Master.
idea why this is all happening. Anyhow, very interesting, certainly. And I know in New York that we have the problem of paying for paying off rabbis for divorces from for oops. Let me see if I can get this play from current slide. This is not unknown. So I think what makes that episode so valuable is that this guy is a Israeli who talked about all of these this Israeli crime. So it's a long episode.
Hi.
All right. So now we're going to talk for a minute about the political influence of the mob in Israel, and welcome to the new people on both Facebook and on Zoom. In 2010, the U.S. Embassy in Israel expressed concern about Inbal Gavrieli, who Frank spoke about, who was the niece of one of Israel's most prominent members. Sorry, this is. I'm having trouble with my mouse. Okay. She was elected to Knesset for the Likud party, and she tried to use her parliamentary immunity to prevent her father's house from being searched by the Israeli police during an investigation into illegal gambling and tax evasion, compounded by concerns about the influence of organized crime in the Likud. And her father, Shuni Gavrieli, is suspected of being a ranking member of the crime family. And in 29, her cousin was murdered in what was suspected to have been a gangland slaying. And the video also talked about the Israeli crime families, the Egyptian Moroccan Jews who started their organized crime, and many of whom, when they left these countries, they ended up in the camps and with dire poverty and all the conditions for breeding organized crime. Now, the Israeli Arab organized crime groups are also formed in Israel, and Frank referred to some of them, and so did the broadcast. Clans like the Taibbi and Abdel Kader family are involved in extortion, drug and weapon trafficking, fraud, as well as money laundering, often cooperating with their Jewish counterparts. And the Jarushi family from Ramallah is one of the most powerful crime families. Another one is a Kal Raja family, and they had a huge war resulting in the death of 24 people in 1990, and the government forced them to have a ceasefire where the Khorajas left Ramallah and settled somewhere else, and but But another example was a criminal gang around Musa Aliyan in New York City, whose main business was the importation of heroin. And here's a short video on Arab crime, on the Arab-Israeli crime.
More than 4 million people have been displaced, while
It's,
much of the population stands on the brink.
Here we go.
21, a gang-related crime wave claimed the lives of 128 Israeli Arabs, a record
This was
number
just
which includes
last
women
year.
and children caught in the crossfire. The victims' families accuse the police of neglect. The government, though, has promised to do more. Iris Makler sent us this report from Kalanswa, a town located in Israel's center, where criminals have formed a state within a state.
These two women lost their children on the same night last year. 19-year-old Lais attended a party held by her neighbor, 20-year-old Mohammed. Then two gunmen arrived.
They entered through here. They opened the door. You can still see the traces of bullets. They waved their gun barrels around the room and started shooting. They opened fire randomly, without knowing who they were aiming at, who was going to live, who was going to die. They didn't care.
The assassins fled. Lais and Mohammed died instantly. The women know the murderers. Two brothers affiliated with organized crime who had a dispute with Mohammed. A few months earlier, they'd shot at the house.
It's not the first time they've come and the police haven't done anything. After they shot at our house, the police came. They noted the position of the bullets. They put up a barrier and that's all. Thank you, bye. Everyone warned them and they didn't protect us. They are police only in name. We don't know anything about the case. We don't even know there's a case at all. We are part of the state of Israel and the state must enforce our rights.
128 Israeli Arabs lost their lives in gangland violence last year. Only a fraction of the killers were prosecuted. The Israeli government now says it intends to act, allocating more than €600 million to the task. But the gangs remain powerful, as police in Kalanswa discover. This morning, a police unit's going out on a raid.
We have several targets, influential criminals in the Arab districts. You have to search the places outlined in the briefing well.
For several months, the unit has been collecting intelligence on weapons stashes here. They search two houses thoroughly. In an empty lot nearby, they make their first discovery.
These are explosives. The bomb squad is coming. Criminals use this to intimidate innocent people in the city.
Police remove the explosives, watched by residents. Back at the station, they lay out their haul of cannabis and weapons. The lead detective says he's a bit disappointed.
It's good work, but it's not our biggest catch.
Police say there are 500,000 firearms circulating in a community of less than 2 million.
Weapons sometimes come from the Palestinian Authority. Sometimes they're imported from foreign countries. There are thefts. There are also homemade weapons. So when we act against traffickers, it cuts off the supply.
There is an increased police presence, but the shootings continue. 6 people have been killed in Israeli Arab towns since the new year, including a 4-year-old boy.
Syrian Kurdish forces say they fought
So we can see that
at least 300 Islamic State fighters.
Much of the problem is that the Israeli police do not do anything to protect the Arabs from crime in Israel. Now I want to talk a little bit about the Russian mob, because the Russian mafia is a factor both in Israel and in the United States. And it began with Israel with a mass immigration of Russian Jews to Israel in 1989, but it began actually earlier in America around the turn of the century, and we'll talk about that in a minute. Jewish Russian crime bosses such as Semyon Mogilevich acquired Israeli citizenship and laundered money through Israel. The Russian mafia saw Israel as an ideal place to launder money, as Israel's banking system was designed to encourage Aliyah for Jews and who could bring their money. Following the trend of global financial deregulation, Israel implemented legislation easing the movement of capital. So when they saw money was coming in, which was good for the banks and good for all the money launderers in the Knesset, they passed laws to make it easier. So combined with the lack of anti, every time I breathe, I changes. Combined with the lack of anti-money laundering legislation, Russian organized crime founded Israel a great place to launder. In 2005, police estimated the Russians had laundered between 5 and 10 billion in 15 years since the end of the Soviet Union. And non-Jews, Jewish Russians tried to get fake passports. Russian, Georgian, and Ukrainian Jewish criminals have also now been able to set up networks in the United States following the large migration of Russian Jews to New York City, particularly Brooklyn, Brighton Beach, and Miami, but also in European cities such as Berlin, Antwerp. Russian Jewish mobsters include Marat Balagula, Efsel Agron, and their gangs in the US. The Soviet Jewish Russian troops were involved in racketeering, prostitution, drug extortion, gasoline tax fraud, as well as murder. I had a friend of mine who was a probation officer in Brooklyn, and she had a lot. So this is a short video, which is kind of funny about the Russian mafia in Brooklyn and these other.
Now, a special CBS News investigation about what Attorney General Michael Mukasey calls a growing threat to our security. International organized crime. He's going after it, and tonight we take you inside it. Our chief investigative correspondent, Armin Katan, gives you an exclusive look at the Russian mob.
How many times have we walked this boardwalk before?
Many. They were known as Z and Louie, thick and thin. Partially disguised, they talked for the first time to CBS News about their nearly 10 years as undercover agents for the FBI.
What were the kind of roles that you played here? Well, we portrayed ourselves as not only high rollers, but wise guys from Atlantic City.
With big-time U.S. Customs connections and a bankroll to match.
The $2,000 dinners, the fancy cars, and yes, I did fit in one.
More than 100 nights a year, Z and Louie wined and dined their way around Atlantic City, slowly working their way in, helping to expose the magnitude of the Russian mafia. Diamond and arms dealing, cigarette smuggling, healthcare and credit card fraud, cybercrime, and an appetite for violence.
They have no qualms about murdering people.
If they have to kill you, they'll kill you.
Absolutely.
CBS News has learned that hundreds of FBI agents in New York are now devoted to fighting what one top official called an explosive growth in organized crime, fueled by the growing influence of Asian, Albanian, and Russian mobs. In the last 3 years in New York alone, the FBI has indicted more than 300 non-traditional crime figures.
The public has a perception that organized crime has largely gone away. That, of course, is not at all true.
In the last 15 years, the Russian mob based here in Brighton Beach, Brooklyn, has grown into an intimidating force, a lucrative international enterprise stretching from Moscow to Israel to Thailand to the United States, blending old-fashioned brutality with high-tech skills. The Russians' massive smuggling operations were run out of this port in Newark, New Jersey. One ingenious scam to avoid paying taxes had tanker loads of wood grain alcohol being shipped back to the motherland. Vodka with a twist.
They would dye it blue. They would label it windshield washer fluid, ship it to Russia, undye it, and then sell it as vodka.
In time, Louie and Z left the shores of the Atlantic for Zurich, Switzerland, in a far more menacing situation, a meeting with a high-ranking Russian general offering his government's arsenal for sale.
And we're talking long-range missiles, tanks, submarines, everything.
The danger was driven home last week with the New York indictment of notorious Russian arms dealer Viktor Bout, captured in Thailand in March. He was charged with selling weapons to a terrorist group to be used to kill Americans. Hardly a scene from The Sopranos. Italian organized crime.
So this guy Bout is the one, by the way, that Russia may ask for release from prison in return for the woman NBA player who has been arrested in Russia, so that Brittany Griner may be her release may be in exchange for this guy Boot.
Neighborhood, drugs, prostitution, sports betting, traditional stuff. This is way up the ladder.
Exactly. And if they'll sell that to a couple of mob guys from Jersey, what are they selling to Al Qaeda terrorists? It's all available for the right price. Greed drives everything.
Wise words from a couple of unlikely wise guys who played their part in the war against the mob. Armin Katay and CBS News.
Very interesting indeed.
Now, especially
Now, the Israeli mob in the United States got set up basically in the 80s, headed by Johnny Atias in New York, dubbed the Israeli Mafia. It pulled off the biggest gold heist in the history of Manhattan's jewelry district, getting away with over $4 million in gold jewelry. Atias was murdered in 1990, and the Mafia kind of fell apart soon afterwards, but several members, including Ron, especially Ron Gonen, had turned informant, and the authorities arrested the rest of the gang at the September that year. And I've been reading this book, Blood and Volume, inside the New York's Israeli Mafia. It's a very interesting book. You can get it Amazon, and I'm reading it as an ebook. And now the Israeli mob was very involved in the Abigail and the Rosenstein crime organization, heavily involved in ecstasy trafficking, that the Israeli organized crime elements were in control of the entire multi-billion-dollar U.S. ecstasy trade, from production to international smuggling trade. That's big, that this tiny country, the criminals from this tiny country are able to control the entire ecstasy trade in the United States. And one of the way they did it was through the Israeli and Italian mob connections. The Israelis became the main drug supplier of the former Gambino family, and they illegally distributed more than 1 million ecstasy pills from May 1999 to 2000, with a wholesale value of 7 million. Another Israeli, Tuito, said to have one of the largest ecstasy smuggling organizations that imported millions of ecstasy pills in Paris, Brussels, Frankfurt, into New York, Miami, and LA, was arrested, but it's still going on. Now, one of the things that's really fascinating, the broadcaster alluded to the fact that actually the Israeli mob was derived from the American Jewish mafia. And so this is a short video on the history of the Jewish mafia that I think you'll find really
educating myself and the audience on the history of the Jewish mob.
Okay, I'll be glad to. So, the Jewish mob basically starts at the time of the large immigration from East Europe in the late 1880s, 1890s. And of course, poverty, they come into the United States, they move into the cities, and they form the ghettos of the United States, whether it's Baltimore, whether it's Boston, New York, Brooklyn, Detroit, Chicago, Cleveland. And the original Jewish gangster was really, it was brutal. He was a brute. It was brutal. In fact, there's a book that I read many, many years ago that said 25% of the prisoners in the New York prison system were Jews. What were the crimes? A lot of the crimes were violence.
What year was this?
Probably at the turn of the 20th century.
Got it.
Right? And the name of the book was called The Rise and Fall of the Jewish Gangster, Jewish Mobster, something like that. The interesting part about it, Patrick, was that they were involved in all forms of shakedowns, violence, beatings, murders, and prostitution.
Okay.
All right. the majority of the prostitute in that time were Jewish women. They'd come, they couldn't find their husbands, and the pimps would be waiting for them on the piers.
Majority of the prostitutes in the 20s were Jewish.
Not 20s, late 1890s. 1890s, 1900s.
Got it. Okay.
So it was really brutal crime. Now, the generation that comes up that was either born in the United States or had recently immigrated from Europe, let's say, for example, Meyer Lansky, Benny Siegel, Lepke Bullcoulter, My Father's World, and so forth. Some of them were born here, and some were born on the other side and came as young kids. Right? And I'm talking now post-1900. So these kids start as gangs, and what they want, it's control of territory, neighborhoods, and so forth, and the control of the ghetto. They had a responsibility as well, and that was to protect the ghetto from the being invaded and beat up by kids from other ethnicities. And so the bush cart vendors and the storekeepers, they would depend on these young kids to defend the neighborhood. The young kids were responsible to take care of the fathers, the uncles, the grandparents, the cousins, and everybody. That was the responsibility.
The other way around. Instead of parents, it was the kids.
The kids that took care. Very good point.
So if you like to set a short clip from an interview I did, click over here to watch the entire
So that was
interview.
certainly very interesting history. Okay, so let me see. Oops. So the other issue that I think is very important to talk about. Okay, so these are pictures of some of the Zev Rosenstein. Oops, I just knocked over my phone. And his pictures of Zev Rubenstein and Itzhak Abergil. Now, this is a very important thing to think about: is Israeli extradition of criminals, and this is a very important situation that's still a problem today. Still a problem today. So what is extradition? Extradition is the removal of a person or surrender of an accused person from one state to another. One of the legal and moral dilemmas Israel has faced throughout its history as a Jewish nation is this question of extradition, because it calls into question the nature of Israel as a haven for Jews of all sorts, criminal and non-criminal. Is everybody going to be able to get in? So in his 1896 treatise, Herzl supported extradition, arguing that delivering criminals readily to the states where the crime was committed was a matter of honor. So Herzl was in favor of extradition. And the British mandate established the 1926 extradition ordinance that Israel adopted and applied until 1954. 1950 law of return established the Jewish homeland as a haven for Jews, allowing all Jews to receive immediate Israeli citizenship upon immigrating to Israel. This without setting any cap on immigration. This policy was set with full awareness that that allowing all Jews meant allowing all Jewish criminals as well. So in 1954, they changed the law. The Knesset amended the law of return to allow the Minister of the Interior to refuse Israeli citizenship to people with criminal backgrounds. And they also repealed the old law of 1881 in 1926, no longer applicable. So, but the 1954 Act required an agreement of reciprocity between Israel and the requesting state, as well as dual criminality, that the offense for which the extradition was sought would be a crime in both Israel and the offending nation. An extradition could only be sought in capital cases if the offended nation agreed not to use the death penalty. So it also allowed for the refusal of extradition if it felt that a Jew was being accused on the basis of race alone. So during the next decade, Israel struck a number of bilateral treaties with foreign countries who sought the extradition of Israeli criminals. This way, Israel kind of made extradition on a case-to-case basis. But there was a lot of opposition to extradition after 1962. After a problem rose by when Robert Soblin, an American Jew, fled to Israel after being convicted of espionage in the US, and he committed suicide on the way back to the United States for his trial. This led Menachem Begin, opposition Likud party leader, to speak out very strongly against extradition. And the refusal to extradite citizens is known as the continental system because by the end of the 19th century, it was common practice amongst continental states. Another high profile of the other cases against extradition was in 1977 when Reuben Pesachowicz, an Israeli citizen, was sought by Switzerland for fraud. Pesachowicz argued that because Swiss law precluded its citizens from expedition, his expedition from Israel should also be barred. Remember, it was just between continental Europe that extradition was barred. The court, however, ruled against Pesachowicz, caused a major outcry in Israeli society against the practice of extradition. So lots of propaganda against extradition. A guy named Shmuel Flato Sharon published a pamphlet in France that argued that every Jew in the world should be provided with Israeli passports so they can receive sanctuary in the event of persecution. And he campaigned for Likud on an anti-extradition platform, won a seat in the Knesset. In the same year, Begin, who was took control of the government, was also a strong opponent of extradition. So in 1978, the extradition ends with the Offenses Committed Abroad Act, eliminated extradition of Israeli citizens and switched Israel back to the continental system. Crimes committed by Israeli citizens abroad could be prosecuted in Israel. The Extradition Act was amended so that no Israeli citizen could be extradited except for offenses committed before he became Israeli. The new law was treated with concern by some academics who saw it as a way for Israelis to commit crimes abroad and harm relations with other countries. But Israelis were supportive. They felt this was good. It made truly a Jewish nation. Troubles came in the 1990s, concern that Israel was becoming a haven for Jewish criminals, which it was, and this was bad for international relations. 97, finally a big murder committed by an American Jewish teenager named Samuel Scheibein. His father was Israeli, his mother was American. He'd never been to Israel. He was accused of a gruesome murder in Maryland. And because of the 1952 nationality law, he was an Israeli citizen. And because of the 1978 Extradition Act, he flew to Israel to proclaim protection from the government. Because the state of Maryland allows the death penalty and Israel does not. And Scheibein used that as a basis of the argument that also that Israel did not have the power to extradite him and he should be tried in his own courts for the crime he committed abroad. The case was brought before the Supreme Court in Israel, which ruled in his favor, claiming his citizenship exempted him from extradition. He pleaded guilty to the murder in Jerusalem, and the American Congress was very angry and threatened to cut off aid. And in addition, it was a very abuse of the 1978 because Scheibein had never had any attachment to the state of Israel, let alone visited Israel before he went there as a refuge. So in response to the Scheibein affair in 1999, the Knesset passed an amendment number 6 to the Extradition Act, which permitted the extradition of Israeli citizens who had committed crimes abroad. This way, it divided Israelis into 2 categories: those who are residents of Israel at the time of extradition request is made, and those who are not residents at the time. The former people who are residents are then returned to Israel for sentencing, but the latter group may be extradited and serve sentences in either the state where the crime was committed or in Israel. But this 1999 law leaves lots of loopholes. It was an attempt to distance Israel with its reputation as being a haven for criminals. But many people say there's still too many loopholes in the law. And one of the more recent serious problems is that Israel has become a refuge for Jewish pedophiles. So let's have a look at that.
A CBS News investigation has uncovered a loophole that allows accused and convicted American pedophiles to escape justice by moving to Israel. So Ian Lee has been following this for more than a year, and he traveled to Israel for this investigation. He worked with a group that tracks people accused of sex crimes, which estimates dozens of Americans have used this loophole.
So, he's 6'2". We are on a stakeout looking for this man, Jimmy Julius Caro, 48 years old and wanted on charges of sexually assaulting a 9-year-old girl in Oregon back in 2000 and a 5-year-old girl in Israel in 2001. He's considered dangerous. But these photos are a few years old, so we don't know if he'll look the same. He remains elusive. Previous attempts to capture him have failed.
Obviously, the fear that he would somehow figure out that anyone's looking for him and bolt. He just called his number.
Shauna Aronson got a tip that Caro's expected at this clinic near Tel Aviv. Who's going to call? She's with JCW, Jewish Community Watch, an organization that hunts down accused pedophiles who flee to Israel from the U.S., exploiting a process called Law of Return, whereby any Jewish person can move to Israel and automatically gain citizenship. The ease with which pedophiles seem able to use this law as an escape route haunts victims like Mendy Hall, who says he was abused from age 8 by a teacher at an Orthodox Jewish school in Los Angeles. So your classroom is right here. How does it feel being back?
I was very anxious and, stressed coming back here, and a lot of memories coming through my mind.
Memories of his alleged abuser, Mordechai Yom Tov, who taught him Hebrew studies when he was just 8 years old.
So in the beginning, he would just rub me outside of my pants, and then about 3 to 4 months later, he started going in.
Reaching down your pants.
Yeah, it's reaching down.
Why did you feel like you couldn't tell anyone?
I was scared. I was ashamed. I just didn't know what people would think of me and the whole situation.
Yom Tov pled guilty in 2002 to sexually abusing and committing lewd acts against 3 other boys. He served jail time, but when he was released, he violated his probation and, according to JCW, fled to Israel with help from individuals within the Orthodox Jewish community. JCW tracked Yom Tov down and confronted him with a hidden camera in Jerusalem, where he admitted to illegally fleeing the United States with help and using a fake passport to enter Israel.
I was supposed to stay for 5 years in the same city. I was supposed to take from the outside of the city. I was supposed to drive it to the police station. I left within a week later.
He had this message for his victims.
I'm very, very, very sorry.
The other person in this video is Mayor Seawald, the founder of Jewish Community Watch. He tells CBS News Yom Tov's case isn't uncommon in the Orthodox community.
The same thing that's going on in the Catholic Church right now around the world, the exact same thing happens in our community. The rabbis say it's, you know what, he promised he's going to go for therapy, he's never going to do it again. Boom, he's in another community. A few years later, he's at the same thing, and we hear more allegations that the person continued to abuse children.
And often, those abusers end up in Israel. Rabbi Yehuda Oppenheimer says he unwittingly helped Caro escape. There was nothing that raised any red flags up to the point where he was moving to Israel.
Well, I wish I could say that, but unfortunately I can't say that. So he had violated his parole, and now they were looking for him. He said that there was something in the past that happened when he was young, but nothing had ever happened since. I've changed and I'm a different person now, but you gotta help me. I felt that I could trust him. So I wrote him a letter, and he bought a ticket, and he left.
Caro is accused of abusing more children when he got to Israel. What was that like for you when you found that out?
Punch to the gut. It was very painful.
Rabbi Oppenheimer says the reason he came forward is to shine a light on the process of accused pedophiles fleeing, to help ensure it doesn't happen again. Back at the stakeout, an ambulance pulls up and a man steps out. It's Caro.
That was definitely him. Oh my God.
The police are called and eventually arrive. His days on the run are over as he's led away.
Did you assault the girl in the United States? Did you flee Israel because you assaulted the girl in the United States? Have you ever assaulted any girls in Israel? Do you know that you're wanted by Interpol?
There's relief as police escort him to their car. This marks the end to a months-long manhunt.
Oh my gosh. Can I give you a hug? I have something I need to tell you. Yeah. Okay. We found him, and he was just arrested.
What?
He was just arrested.
Wow. Oh my gosh. You made
Amuna, not her real name, is the person on the other end of the line. She was a little girl when Cairo entered her life.
I was 4 or 5 years old. My mother was on bed rest. My father's a rabbi, so he wasn't really home. He used to come to our house. We used to play games, and then it became sexual. I'm going to give you a cookie because you do it so nicely. It's all about the cookie. It's all about lying, and it's all about being so evil to a little child. He also threatened me he would kill my parents. He would choke me. He would hold me. He would kidnap me.
How did that affect you?
A lot. Yeah. It affected my whole life. My whole life is around this sexual abuse and rape. Yeah.
Amuna turned to therapy and art to help deal with the trauma.
This is in my bedroom and my inspiration.
She paints and writes poetry, but she's still angry that it was allowed to happen in the first place.
What are your thoughts on him being able to come to Israel and flee the United States?
It brings up a lot of anger and a lot of frustration towards the Israeli system.
Shauna says the failure begins in the U.S.
Why would someone want to help one of these pedophiles escape?
Oftentimes, there's some sort of community incentive. Either somebody owes them a favor, or someone in the community, let's say an institution, has covered up for them in the past, and they know that if this goes to court, there's a lot of civil liability coming down the line, and it's going to cost a lot of money to a lot of people, and nobody wants to deal with that.
Shauna accuses the Israeli police of not prioritizing accused pedophiles on the run.
Why do you have to be the ones that do this?
Because nobody else is. I don't have any better answer than that.
And if you guys weren't doing it,
then nobody would do it.
Israeli police told CBS News that, quote, the police coordinate closely with the Ministry of Justice and worldwide police organizations in order to find suspects overseas. Today, Cairo faces charges in Israel, while back in the United States, the district attorney's office in Clackamas County in Oregon told CBS News they are working with federal authorities to secure his extradition. But Mordechai Yom Tov remains at large. The district attorney here in Los Angeles told us they have not requested Yom Tov's extradition and that they had no other comment. Jewish Community Watch says that is the problem. If American officials don't try to get accused pedophiles from Israel, then they simply escape justice and leave children at risk. The U.S. Department of Justice declined to comment on specific cases, but praised their relationship with Israel's law enforcement, adding sex offenders have been successfully extradited in the past. Days after Cairo's arrest, Amuna confronted him at an Israeli police station.
It was good. It was good to confront him. It was important for me to have that closure in my life.
The healing process will continue for Amuna, but for many, like Mendy, the lack of justice means the pain continues. So there are two things JCW says could help close this pathway. First, better background checks on people moving to Israel. And second, more willingness from U.S. authorities to pursue the accused.
So it certainly seems like law enforcement, both here and in Israel, are sort of busy patting themselves on the back on how well they cooperate with one another. But the Jewish Community Watch needs to be doing most of that grunt work, that on the ground investigating. Why do they say, the group, why do they say more pedophiles aren't being apprehended?
So it's very complicated when you leave the United States and go to Israel. First, they say that once these people are wanted, that they need to go to Interpol and have that international arrest warrant put out for them so that the Israeli authorities can then start looking for them. Extradition is expensive, and a lot of these jurisdictions just don't have the money or manpower to really pursue them. And then when you get to the Israeli side, JC
JCW says that they need to be doing more background checks on these people. Sometimes a simple Google search will bring up, especially if it's an Interpol arrest warrant, will bring that up, and so that they can then know this person is dangerous, they should not be let in. Or if there is an arrest warrant out for them, that they need to go and pick them up. And JCW says that there just isn't the priority to go and pick these people up, that the police don't have the resources there to go and look for these people as well. So it really does fall on JCW to track them from the United States to Israel.
That's unbelievable. Just JCW also sort of believe that aside from law enforcement, there are sort of other elements of the community that need to work on this.
Yeah, and that's another big part of this, is that a lot of the times these people have help. And help within the community, people that help them flee to Israel. Sometimes, as we saw with Yom Tov, he had help to JCW to flee the country through Mexico and then get a passport. Fake immigrant to Israel. So
These are elaborate schemes.
They are, and they need a lot of people to pull off. And they say that there needs to be a conversation within the community about not protecting people. And then that's where it's so important to have Rabbi Oppenheimer, come forward and talk about this and say, this is something that is happening, and we need to address this. And and he said, the important thing is, if someone comes to you, don't be so trusting. Look into their background, especially if there's someone who wants to immigrate very quickly. Take some time to make sure this isn't a person who's trying to flee justice.
Yeah, he was a really good element to your story, because sometimes, it's not everyone's bad. They're good people just trying to help out, and they find themselves sort of caught up in a bad situation.
Exactly.
Hey, Ian, it's really nice having you here, too. Thank you.
Great to be here. Thank you.
All right.
Okay, that was certainly interesting. Israel admits that it participates in other crimes. In the 1990s, forensic pathologists harvested organs from dead bodies, including Palestinians, without permission of their families. They are supposedly ameliorating this. Another problem, the Arabs continuing to bear the brunt of organized crime in Israel, which we saw in the earlier slide, and that crime, a number of factors fuel organized crime in the Arab communities. Much of it has to do with money, because it offers them quick and easy access to money. And the distrust that the Palestinian community has towards the Israeli police is one of the primary factors in the lack of ability. So meanwhile, crime continues in Israel, and the Israeli mafia continues to operate here, despite a pledge by Israeli Prime Minister Bennett and Omar Bar-Lev to crack down heavily on organized crime and illegal weapons. The violence continues, and it continues both in Israel, in Jewish communities and Palestinian communities, despite claims by authorities that it has decreased. And the danger posed by gangs has increased significantly with their adaptation of car bombs as a weapon. So that's the PowerPoint. It's kind of depressed from Melvin. We had a little longer session because a lot of this information is extremely important to know. And thank you for the extra people, Boizai Rani, Sebi, Maidu Mandal, Mustafa Fijor, watching on Facebook. If anybody has any comments or they want, I muted some people because of the sound coming from your computer. So if you want to unmute yourselves, I'm going to ask some people to unmute themselves. I'm going to ask for comments that anybody might have. I think Tom, I muted you. Ed Brody, I muted you. Mary, I think I muted most people because of this sound coming from somebody, and I didn't know who it was. So, does anybody have anything they'd like to comment on as we discuss? Kelvin, are you talking?
Hello, Jackie.
Yeah. Hi.
Just to make a coffee. I'm watched your little video. How are you doing?
I'm good. Do you have anything to say about Israeli crime? I know you spent a lot of
Yeah,
time.
I do. Can I come next though? Can I just get myself prepared and I'll come in 5 minutes? Or
Yeah.
first, or I come in now?
Your sound is, I don't know, you're making sound.
Hello? Hello?
Yeah, hi.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you, but something is making sound. Can you mute yourself until you come back?
Absolutely. Let me do that. Okay. I'll be 5 minutes and now I'll just ping you. I'll be here. Okay. Just mention me. Okay. I'll be here. Yeah.
So does anybody have any comments about what you heard? And if you have a comment, if you're muted, you could please unmute yourself.
Jackie, I don't know how, you said you muted me, but I was muted, so I don't know how that happened, but anyway.
I muted you because it was like some kind of funny buzzing.
What I'm saying is I had muted myself.
Oh,
It
okay.
should have been muted.
Oh,
So I don't know how that might have happened.
who knows?
As soon as I came on, I muted myself.
Yeah.
But anyway, the curious thing for me on this Michael Sana is what is left that these people see as a value in Israel. It's beyond me. It's like, you know, the evidence just mounts continually about, you know, this place that is lawless, and you know, it's really curious to me. I wish he was here to ask him that question. So I don't know that anybody else could answer that.
Basically, Jews feel unsafe in living around the rest of the world because of anti-Semitism. They feel they need to have Israel as a safe place for Jews to live. That's the mentality so they'll put up with a lot of problems in Israel because they feel that Jews need a safe place to live.
Well, that's a standard line, but he's not just, that's not what he's saying at all. He still is expressing an enthusiasm for Israel that's the part that I don't understand.
Well, he said it's good and bad, that there's good parts and bad parts. And the good part is that Jews feel safe there, although I'm not sure how safe they really feel, since the way they have to treat the Palestinians. If they felt safe, they wouldn't have to occupy Palestine, would they? If they felt safe, they wouldn't have to have the horrible violence towards Palestinians. So it's a contradiction. You're right, Tom. It's an absolute contradiction. But people live with ambiguity and contradiction for a wide variety of factors.
Hi.
Hi, Tom. You want to?
I did hear what he said now as well about this lawlessness. Now, it's so pervasive. And yet on the, let's say that the secular Jewish society of Israel that I experienced there has some sense that there is some law going on internally. I'm not talking about the international situation, which we know quite a lot about from previous discussions. I'm talking about if you were there in Tel Aviv or you were there in Jerusalem, or in somewhere like Rehoboth or Beersheba, or they're all kind of weird places, but they do have some sense that there is a police if something happens. Do you know what I mean? For example, if you're abused, raped, for example, or something like that, drugs, for example. But what seems to be there as goes up and up and up and up beyond any borders at some point is a layer of stratified, is it called indemption or what's it called? Exemption, not exemption, but it's almost like you imagine the whole thing of like, okay, you can go to the highest court in the world, but if it's run by Masons, do you know what I mean? At some point, the decision is not as a representation of a servant of the public and public idea of law. So there are different laws for people in different levels of society. Now, I have looked very, very much into this international intelligence stuff, and I'm sure I've only touched the surface of it because there's reports of massive organ harvesting stuff going on, and that also connects with China, and it connects with probably all over the world. The Vatican started an anti-child abuse project, and they deliberately distanced it from the Vatican and gave it independence because there's accusations of child abuse inside the Vatican. And I was in touch with them because the nuns here said, look, you seem to be praying about this a lot in church about the victims of abuse. Could you have a look at if we could start up a local chapter of this in Jordan? And they were looking, but they didn't have the time, energy, or lawyers, because I don't think those nuns can deal with the legal side of it. I said, you separate it. You work with the women, have somebody to deal with the legal side of it, separate it. So the thing in Israel is that I don't know about the religious community, because I think that if you look like it's very complicated, because you seem to have religious Jews who are genuinely religious people and have standards. You also seem to have some kind of weird side of religious Judaism. And I haven't looked into this because it is so deep and complex. And I just felt like my head cannot take it all in, but it does exist, this interface between political Zionism and rabbinical Judaism. What I am aware is that rabbinical Judaism has a massive, like imagine a wheel with lots of different colors around, has a lot of different aspects. Within each of those communities, you'd have different types of individuals as well. So you have like the true Torah Jews, for example, that are out in London protesting for Palestine. They say Zionism shouldn't exist, Israel shouldn't exist. You have similar in New York. I'm sure you must know about them.
Yeah.
And then the extreme on the other side is that people like Brendan O'Connell, John Swin, who I find very extreme, I can't bear to listen to on one side because they always try to push their research towards their own biases and conclusions, but they have an insanely deep research, a lot of useful stuff. You can take it for a back step. Brendan O'Connell was kicked out of Australia for exposing these kind of Jewish rings in an influence on Australian politics. Now, there are these extreme cults, like talk about the connections of people like Kushner with them, some of the Russian Jews. You see, they want to say it's all Russian Jews, and I don't believe it's all Russian Jews. I think it's much more international. So, the called Chabad Lubavitch, and there do seem to be Talmudic Jews that actually kind of believe that you can do what you want with Gentiles, for example. So where do local Israeli laws apply to people whose own internal teachings say, well, Gentiles are disposable? And also within their communities, I think there are some very vague interpretations because they weren't clear like Jesus about what is okay and what isn't okay within relationships. There's some very vaguenesses that can be read all kind of different ways about what is okay in terms of male-female relationships. And the age thing doesn't seem to be a limit within some of it. And I mean, even those true Torah Jews in London, I've no idea if they did all with kids or stuff like that, because they never talk about it. They say they're pro-Palestine. I don't know. And I think the only way that you would know is to have a really detailed study or knowledge of those communities, and also to be in it or to have somebody who was inside it. Like this guy in the interview is very brave, and to talk about that stuff. Do you know what I mean? It's very brave to go out and talk about that stuff in a public where people know your name. So, okay, that's one level, is like, how much is there accountability? Now, Israel seems to have an international unaccountability. And my proposition is that one of the reasons it was created in this region in this way, I don't believe that political Zionism is always by Zionists who are hardcore religious Zionists. Sometimes it's a tool for making an incredible amount of power, money, like the Khazarians converting to Judaism originally. A lot of the Ashkenazis descended from Khazarians. The Khazarians originally seem to have, you're talking about all those families, Rothschilds, Rockefellers, all those kind of things, a lot of them seem to have converted to Judaism for geopolitical reasons. And at that time, it was that the Arabs and Christians hated each other, but they could actually pretty much trade with both. And they were allowed to do usury or whatever it was and things like that. So they got them something, and that was their only way to make themselves incredibly powerful. So a lot of those Eastern Europeans that ended up to be very religious Jews started off from a very geopolitical interest. So what I wanted to say is, as a country, it has an international immunity. When you start accusing it of too many things, you say most of the world's biggest bankers are Jewish, you'll be accused of anti-Semitism. You look on the statistics and say most of the world's biggest bankers are Jewish, you'll be right. But you're not allowed to say most of the world's biggest bankers are Jewish, because or a disproportionate representation in American media or in media organizations or in high finance worldwide, a disproportionate representation are Jewish. I'm not saying it's the nature of Judaism at all, or any, because I don't believe there's one thing Judaism. It's like saying black people or something like that. You've got so many different people and so many things. You can't blanket a thing under one word. It doesn't work. But it does seem to have a level of international immunity. And what I was aware with some of the Epstein stuff and things like that, Ghislaine was just dying to get off to Israel and disappear.
Yeah.
She probably could have easily got a ticket out from there, because there are people with false passports that they don't even ask for their passport when they land in another place.
That's why they didn't give her any parole. They didn't let her out on parole.
Well, is it because the judge, you see, the question is how much was that a controlled operation all the way to the top? Because Judge Nathan, for example, goes to the same synagogue of Dershowitz. She praised him as being a very educated Jewish scholar, even though she was up there within the case as having very obviously had lots of pedophile experiences with Epstein. So this is the highest judge who made the decision. She goes to the same synagogue as Dershowitz. You say, well, I don't believe that. I think that they kept it at a level for a reason, and controlled at a reason, and limited at a reason. They decided to choose to catch Ghislaine. They had her stored up in New Hampshire. She thought she was going to be let off. They lied to her. They caught her. She never knew if they're going to let her out or not. They could. They could have a SWAT team land on the roof and get in there and fucking get her out. They have that capability. The people handling her have no limit to resources or power.
Well, she's in jail for 20 years now. So
supposedly, yeah, apparently she's in jail for 20 years now, and that's what serves them, and I understand. So one thing in the court was that though the court declared that she had a French passport, a British passport, an American passport, a Terramar passport, which is a whole weird thing. They wanted to make all the non-countries of the ocean into their kind of country. That includes all kind of people. I won't even start. But one thing was that they didn't declare her Israeli passport in the American court case. They wouldn't declare that she has one, even though she has. And all her sisters work for Israel, you know, spying like their father, getting software into all kind of systems, World Economic Forum, UN, and all those kind of things. So there's a level of international immunity. I believe that the higher you go up, the less law applies.
Yeah.
If you want to focus specifically on pedophilia, yes, there are people who have that as a mental psychotic fuck up. There are mostly people who have been abused themselves. I would say mostly, you know, abused people become abusers if they haven't somehow at some point addressed it. It can happen. It's a reactory thing. Could not always, sometimes. It can be healed, but it's hard. And so those people, once they get that, you see, the fact that Israel can hardly be accused of anything. Israel can bomb Gaza for no reason whatsoever, give a stupid excuse like they all hate us, or they're throwing handmade rockets over the border or balloons or something like that. And the world will be like, it takes a lot to shake the world up. And then the UN will be very loath, as Frank saw, to take a criminal case out against them and try and make it succeed. And probably at some point along the line, it'll be blocked because they've got the leverage not to make it succeed. That's normal, because there is power on those levels in so many places. Say is that those people do not need passports even to land in another country. They will not be checked, because there's a level of things going on which is above borders and laws, and those countries are tools for them. But Israel seems to be in one way, the mob center. So if they want certain people to get away with certain things, they will. They've probably got compromise material on an awful lot of people, which says how much they can get away with and how much they can't. And they will give them instructions of what they want them to do, what they can do, and what they can't do.
Elvin, we have to stop.
All right, that's it. Okay, but I mean, I've seen that, yes, there is a lot of pedophilia also used for either blackmail tapes or some kind of lifetime contracts to a higher circuit of people that have no accountability to anybody but their boss. Okay.
Well, thank you very much for
That's
your
all right. Sorry.
And we all know, living in Jordan, that a lot of Arabs from Jordan and other countries love to go to Israel because they can get drugs, sex, and whatever they want in Israel. That it's known in the region as being a place for criminal activity for tourists. Okay, you know, you have health tourism and historical tourism, and you have criminal tourism where people go from the countries surrounding it to have a good time. So anyhow, thanks everybody for joining us, and we will end our session. And again, we are very happy that you were able to hang in and see the entire session. So we hope that you will join us next week. I'm going to be, next week, I will be in Amman. And I believe I will be doing a session on Samia, a wonderful Palestinian artist who's very proud of her Palestinian heritage. I've been trying to get her to show her art. And so I think that will be next week. And also I'm going to be doing a session on the wonderful journalist Al Zuni, who just recently passed away, who was a very outstanding journalist, and I'll be interviewing his family. He was kicked out of Israel. He was even banned from publishing in Jordan. The American government and Israel pressured the Jordanian government to ban him from publishing in his work in Jordan, and he ended up publishing with newspapers in the Gulf region. So that will also be a great session. I will also be going to Ibrahim Al-Hawai's House of Peace on the Mount of Olives. Ibrahim is one of the Sheikh of Peace. He was a friend of Martin Luther King, Gandhi. He still alive and still trying to bring peace. And Israel's still trying to demolish his house. So he's in court all the time. So we'll have an interview with him. And I will be working hopefully in Palestine, doing art therapy there. So over the summer, we'll be having sessions from Jordan and from Palestine. So I look forward to seeing you at the next session. I'll be talking to you soon. Thank you again for coming. Masalama. Peace. Thanks for coming.
Thank you, Jackie. Sorry to come in so late. Love to everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye.